In the early days of the history of psychology, a lot of those people who were associated with the field felt that there was really one way to do psychology, their way. They felt they each felt that their way was sort of the appropriate approach and what we should be doing in psychology. Today, psychology is a much more diverse field, and when it comes to contemporary perspectives in psychology, there are a number of different perspectives that sort of run the gamut. So a pretty broad and diverse perspectives. And so these are some of the different branches of psychology, perspectives, you might say, that are a part of psychology today. So here's a quick overview of them. But again, we're going to take a look at each of them just briefly, and then later in the semester, we'll be coming back to many of these things as we talk about different topics, because many of these have been influential in different areas. So we'll come back as we talk about specific topics during the course of the semester. But to begin with, and actually one of the earliest things we're going to talk about as we get through the history and research methods in psychology is what we sometimes call biopsychology. Biopsychologists, or what we sometimes call biological psychologists, are really interested in how biological or physiological processes influence our functioning. So biological psychologists study how the structure and function of the nervous system generate behavior. Biological psychologists are really interested in things like the brain and the entire nervous system, central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, and they look at how those different parts of the nervous system influence our functioning, or what role different parts play in different areas of our functioning. So biological psychologists are concerned about the brain and different parts of the brain and the role that those different parts play in different areas of our behavior, but they also look at the rest of the nervous system as well and look into a lot of these things as they relate to that nervous system. So things like sensory and motor systems, sleep, and so on. Another contemporary perspective involves, or another sort of branch, is sensation and perception. So this is an area in psychology that is associated with that biopsychology because it focuses on both the physiological aspects of those sensory systems as well as the psychological experience of that sensory information in terms of perception. So in just a few weeks, just a couple of weeks, we will take a look at both of those topics: sensation, how our senses work, and then perception, what our brains do with that information that they take in through our senses, how they interpret it and make use of it. Developmental psychology is another area in psychology, and we will again have a unit on developmental psychology fairly soon. But developmental psychologists are concerned with how we develop as humans from the time of conception all the way up through late adulthood. And developmental psychologists are also interested in death and dying as subjects of study as well. So developmental psychologists are concerned about physical development, so how our bodies develop, but also cognitive development, how our thinking develops and changes over time, as well as social development, and emotional development. How does the way we think about and understand other people change as we get older? How does the way we relate to other people change as we get older? So those are some of the areas we're concerned about when it comes to the social and emotional development. This picture is Jean Piaget. Piaget is a famous, or was a famous, cognitive theorist. He developed a whole theory about how our thinking develops from infancy up to adulthood. And when we take a look at development in a few weeks, we will talk a little bit more about Piaget and some of his ideas. Another area of psychology, another branch, is what we call personality psychology. And personality psychology focuses on those behaviors and thought patterns that are unique to each of us. So basically what we think of as personality. And so there are personality theorists who are concerned about how we come to have the personalities that we have. And that's what a lot of the early personality theorists tended to focus on, people like Sigmund Freud and some others. But personality theorists also look at differences in personality and how we can describe or classify personality. And that's the case with what's known as the 5-factor model, another idea that we'll come back to later in the semester. But that 5-factor model suggests that there are 5 basic personality dimensions that we all vary on. So these would be examples of those dimensions: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The idea is that each of us are at different points on this continuum between low and high. And so we could look at each of these traits or each of these dimensions and sort of figure out where we might be. There are actually tests that are designed to do that for us that we'll talk about a little bit later. But that will give us a good description or a good picture of who a particular individual is. In addition to personality psychology, another contemporary branch in psychology is social psychology. And social psychologists are concerned with how people interact and relate to one another. They're concerned with how our behavior as individuals is influenced by others and by situations or settings that we find ourselves in. And so these are some of the areas that social psychologists are interested in: prejudice, attraction, interpersonal conflict, obedience, and many others. And on this slide, you see the announcement that was posted for an experiment, or actually a series of studies that were done by a gentleman named Stanley Milgram on obedience. And these are fairly well-known studies that were a part of social psychology. So we'll come back and we'll talk about his studies and others, the Stanford Prison Experiment, things like that, and what the information that they and other social psychology work had given us in terms of why we behave certain ways in certain situations and not in others, or when we're in the presence of certain individuals. Another area in contemporary psychology is health psychology. And health psychology is interested in how different types of factors interact to influence our health and our well-being. So many health psychologists take what's called the biopsychosocial approach, and that means that they look at all of those different types of factors: the biological, what's going on inside your body; the psychological, what's going on inside your mind; and then the social, what's going on in terms of your environment and your experiences. And a bit later, we'll look at some things related to health psychology. Clinical psychology is another area, and this is probably what a lot of people think of when they think of the field of psychology, because this is the branch of psychology that's concerned with diagnosing and treating psychological disorders and other problematic patterns and that kind of thing. So as part of clinical psychology, clinical therapy and counseling are a part of that. And that therapy and that counseling can take a variety of forms, some of which are influenced by some of those other branches that we've talked about with contemporary psychology, but also some of the schools of thought that were associated with those more historical perspectives. And then a few other areas: industrial organizational psychology, sports and exercise psychology, and forensic psychology. So industrial organizational psychology, psychological theories, principles, and research, and how they apply in those industrial and organizational settings. So companies, workplaces, businesses may employ industrial organizational psychologists as a way to help them figure out how to motivate employees, how to put work teams together, the types of organizational structures that might work well in their particular organization. Sports and exercise psychology, chances are if you hear a famous athlete interviewed after they have won some competition, many of them will sometimes give credit to their sports psychologists. So these are folks who focus on the psychological aspects regarding sports and physical performance. And so looking at helping those athletes perform at their best, deal with anxiety and other issues like that that could be hampering their performance in their sport. And then finally, forensic psychology. Forensic psychology for several years now has been having a moment in a way. This is a branch of psychology that deals with the justice system. And so some of the things that forensic psychologists might do, assessing people to see if they are competent to stand trial. Forensic psychologists might be involved in the sentencing process and may make suggestions as far as sentencing and treatment. They can also advise about eyewitness testimony and the accuracy or lack of accuracy that we see, lack of reliability that we see in that eyewitness testimony. So this is a field that is closely associated with the legal system. So hopefully, even if you're not really that interested in psychology, maybe you found that there is an area in psychology that is in some way relevant to what you are interested in or the field of work that you plan to pursue as you complete your education.